The scar on my left shoulder blade looks like a constellation. 7 perfect circles, each one a memory I tried to forget. Each one a secret my mother told me to carry in silence. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when they're recorded in high definition and stored on a cloud server that nobody thought a 17-year-old girl would know how to access. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Celeste, and this is the story of how a piece of technology meant to protect me became the weapon I needed to save myself. The first time Marcus burned me, I was 14 years old and washing dishes after dinner. My mother had gone to her book club, leaving me alone with the man she'd married 6 months earlier. The man who smiled at neighbors and brought her flowers every Friday. The man who waited until we were alone to show me who he really was. I dropped a plate. Just one plate. It slipped from my soapy hands and shattered against the kitchen floor, sending porcelain pieces skittering across the tiles like scattered dots. I remember the sound echoing through the house, followed by the heavy silence that made my stomach clench with dread. His footsteps were slow, deliberate. Marcus never rushed when he was angry. He savored it, let it build like steam in a pressure cooker until it had nowhere to go but out. I was scrambling to pick up the pieces when his shadow fell across the broken porcelain. "Clumsy little thing, aren't you?" His voice was honey over broken glass, sweet on the surface with something sharp underneath. I kept my eyes down, mumbling apologies as I gathered the larger shards. That's when I saw his feet move, heard the flick of his lighter. The cigarette cherry glowed orange in my peripheral vision. He took a long drag, exhaled slowly, and then his hand was on my shoulder, fingers digging into the muscle there. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, Celeste." I looked up. His face was calm, almost serene, except for his eyes. His eyes were hungry. "You know what happens to careless girls?" he asked, rolling the cigarette between his fingers like he was examining a fine piece of art. I shook my head, throat too tight to speak. "They learn to be more careful." The pain was instant and searing. He pressed the lit end against my shoulder blade, holding it there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. The smell of burning skin and tobacco mixed in the air, and I bit down on my tongue so hard I tasted copper. I didn't scream. I'd learned early that screaming only made things worse with Marcus. Instead, I went somewhere else in my mind, somewhere far from the kitchen and the broken plate and the man who thought pain was a teaching tool. When my mother came home 2 hours later, singing softly to herself and smelling like wine and lavender perfume, I was in my room with the door locked. She knocked gently, asked if I was feeling all right. I told her I was just tired, had finished my homework early and wanted to sleep. The next morning, she noticed me wincing as I reached for the cereal box. "What's wrong with your shoulder, sweetheart?" she asked, not looking up from her coffee cup. Marcus was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, picture of suburban normalcy in his pressed khakis and polo shirt. He glanced over the sports section, eyebrows raised in mild concern. "I think I pulled something in gym class yesterday," I lied, the words coming easier than I expected. "Coach made us do pull-ups and I'm not very strong." My mother nodded absently. "Maybe Marcus can take a look at it. He's good with sports injuries." The smile he gave me was warm, paternal. Of course, I'd be happy to help. I spent the rest of breakfast pushing scrambled eggs around my plate and wondering how someone could look so normal while being so monstrous. How he could sit there drinking orange juice and discussing weekend plans with my mother while the smell of burned flesh still seemed to cling to his fingertips. That first burn healed into a small, round scar that I told myself was barely noticeable. I learned to sleep on my stomach, learned to change clothes in the bathroom with the door locked, learned to wear shirts with higher necklines. Most importantly, I learned to be more careful around Marcus. But careful wasn't enough. The second burn came 3 weeks later. I'd left a textbook on the couch in the living room, something about American history that I needed for a test the next day. Marcus found it before I did. "Celeste." His voice carried from the living room to where I sat in my bedroom, doing algebra homework and trying to ignore the knot of anxiety that had taken permanent residence in my stomach. "Come here, please." Please. He always said please, like politeness could mask cruelty. I found him standing in the living room, my textbook in one hand, a fresh cigarette in the other. The living room was my mother's pride and joy, all cream-colored furniture and carefully arranged throw pillows. She'd spent weeks picking out the perfect coffee table, the right shade of paint for the walls. "Is this yours?" he asked, though we both knew the answer. "Yes, sir." "And where does it belong?" "In my room." "That's right, in your room, not on my wife's furniture, leaving marks on the wood." He set the book down on the coffee table with exaggerated care, then took a long drag from his cigarette. "You know, Celeste, I've been thinking about our conversation the other day, about being careful." My hands started to shake. I clasped them behind my back, hoping he wouldn't notice. "I don't think the lesson stuck," he continued, circling around me like a predator sizing up prey. "I'm sorry, I forgot. It won't happen again." "No," he agreed, stopping directly behind me. This time he chose the inside of my left wrist, a place that would be easier to hide but impossible to ignore. The burn was smaller than the first one, but somehow it hurt worse. Maybe because I knew it was coming. Maybe because this time I understood that this was my life now. After he finished, after he'd ground out the cigarette in the ashtray and gone back to watching television like nothing had happened, I stood in the bathroom and ran cold water over the wound. In the mirror, I looked like myself, but different. Older, sadder, like someone had reached inside and dimmed a light I hadn't realized was there. When my mother asked about the bandage on my wrist the next morning, I told her I'd burned myself taking cookies out of the oven. She reminded me to be more careful and went back to her crossword puzzle. That's when I realized that being more careful wasn't going to save me. Marcus wasn't teaching me lessons about responsibility or respect. He was teaching me about power, about how someone could hurt you in plain sight and no one would see, no one would ask the right questions, no one would save you unless you saved yourself. But I was 14 years old and small for my age, and he was 6 feet tall with hands like iron and a smile that could charm anyone. What was I supposed to do? The answer came 6 months later, during one of my mother's long phone calls with her sister in Portland. I was walking past their bedroom when I heard Marcus's voice, low and intimate.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"She's such a good kid, really. Just needs some guidance sometimes. Teenagers, you know how they can be." I froze outside their door, ear pressed against the wood. "Celeste can be a bit dramatic," my mother was saying, and I realized she was on speakerphone, always making mountains out of molehills. Remember when she convinced herself that her teacher hated her because she got a B on one assignment? Marcus chuckled. "Kids that age, everything feels like the end of the world. But she's learning, getting better at taking responsibility for her actions." They talked for another 10 minutes about my supposed dramatics, my tendency to exaggerate, my need for structure and discipline. By the time they finished, I understood something crucial. If I ever tried to tell anyone what Marcus was doing to me, they wouldn't believe me. Not when he'd spent months laying the groundwork, painting me as an unstable teenager who couldn't be trusted to tell the truth about anything. That night, I lay in bed and counted my scars. 3 by then, small and round and perfectly spaced across my shoulder blade. 3 reminders that I was alone in this. 3 reasons why I had to get smarter, faster, stronger. 3 reasons why I had to start fighting back. The opportunity came in the form of an Amazon delivery box left on our front porch on a Tuesday afternoon in October. My mother was at work, Marcus was in his home office on a conference call, and I was the one who brought in the mail and packages like always. The box was addressed to Marcus, but the shipping label had partially torn, revealing another label underneath. This one was addressed to our neighbors, the Hendersons, who lived 3 houses down and were currently on vacation in Florida. I stood in our foyer, holding a package that wasn't meant for us, and felt something click into place in my mind. If Marcus was willing to keep a misdelivered package, if he was the kind of person who would take something that didn't belong to him, then maybe he was the kind of person who would do other things too, things that could be documented, things that could be proven. I carried the box to his office and knocked on the doorframe. He was still on his call, gesturing with one hand while he talked about quarterly projections and market analysis. When he saw me, he held up one finger, indicating I should wait. "Marcus," he said into his headset, "I'm going to have to call you back. Something just came up." He clicked off and turned to me with that familiar smile. "What's up, kiddo?" I held out the package. "This was delivered to us by mistake. It belongs to the Hendersons." His eyes flicked to the return address, then back to my face. "The Hendersons, huh? They're out of town, aren't they?" "Yes, sir, until next week." "Well then, I guess we'll just hold on to it for them. No point in letting it sit on their porch where anyone could take it." He reached for the package, but I pulled it back slightly. "Shouldn't we call them? Let them know it's here?" Something shifted in his expression, like a mask slipping just enough to show what was underneath. "Celeste, give me the package." "But if it's important, give me the package." His voice was quiet, controlled, but I heard the threat underneath. This was the voice that came right before the cigarette, right before the pain. I handed over the box and watched him set it on his desk like it had always belonged there. "You know what I think?" he said, leaning back in his chair and studying me with those cold, hungry eyes. "I think you've been asking too many questions lately, sticking your nose into things that don't concern you." My mouth went dry. I was just trying to do the right thing. The right thing. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out his pack of cigarettes. "You know what the right thing is, Celeste? The right thing is minding your own business, not questioning the adults in your life, not making trouble where there doesn't need to be trouble." I watched him light the cigarette, watched the flame dance in front of his face, and felt that familiar terror creep up my spine. But underneath the fear was something else, something harder and brighter. Anger. I was tired of being afraid, tired of walking on eggshells in my own home, tired of counting scars and making excuses and pretending that this was normal, that this was what I deserved. "I understand," I said, backing toward the door. "I'll mind my own business." "Good girl." He took a long drag, exhaled slowly. "I knew you were smart. Smart girls don't go looking for trouble." I nodded and left his office, walked calmly to my room, and closed the door behind me. Then I sat on my bed and started planning. If Marcus thought I was going to keep quiet forever, he was about to learn just how smart I really was. The idea came to me during a late-night infomercial about home security systems. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep because my latest burn was still throbbing, when an advertisement came on showing tiny cameras that could be hidden anywhere: smoke detectors, picture frames, teddy bears, even electrical outlets. The narrator spoke about protecting your family, securing your home, having peace of mind when you couldn't be there to watch over the people you loved. But I heard something different in those words. I heard possibility. I started researching the next day during study hall, using the library computers to look up wireless cameras and recording devices. The technology was more advanced than I'd expected, and more affordable. For less than $200, I could buy a system that would record everything and upload it directly to a cloud storage account. It would be motion-activated, virtually invisible, and completely under my control. The only problem was getting $200. I'd been babysitting for the Martins next door since I was 13, earning $20 every Friday night when they went to dinner and a movie. I also helped Mrs. Chen down the street with her grocery shopping, carrying heavy bags up her front steps for $10 each trip. It had taken me months to save up for a new laptop, and I'd spent most of that money already. But I had something else. Something I'd been saving for emergencies, hidden in a shoebox under my bed behind old yearbooks and forgotten stuffed animals. My grandmother's jewelry. She died when I was 10, and she left me a small collection of rings and necklaces that my mother said I could have when I got older. Nothing incredibly valuable, but enough to sell if I needed cash for something important. And this was important. This was survival. I chose a gold chain with a small diamond pendant, something my grandmother had worn to church every Sunday. It felt like betraying her memory, selling something she'd wanted me to have, but I told myself she would understand. She'd always been the one person in my family who actually listened when I talked, who noticed when something was wrong. If she were alive, she would have seen what Marcus was doing. She would have stopped it. The pawn shop downtown gave me $150 for the necklace. No questions asked. I used 50 of it to buy a prepaid credit card, then went to the public library and ordered a wireless camera system online, shipping it to a P.O. box I rented under my own name. The cameras arrived on a Wednesday, small black devices no bigger than a thumb drive, each one designed to look like a common household object. I chose the one that looked like a phone charger, thinking it would blend in naturally in any room. Installing it was easier than I'd expected. The setup app walked me through everything step by step, and within an hour I had a functioning security system that I could monitor from my phone. The camera was motion-activated with night vision, and it automatically uploaded everything to a secure cloud account that only I could access. Now I just had to wait. I didn't have to wait long. Marcus's pattern was predictable. He never touched me when my mother was home, never left marks that would be visible to others, never acted when there was any chance of being caught. He was methodical, careful, and that caution had kept him safe for over a year. But now his caution was working against him, because I knew when he would strike next, and I was ready. The moment came on a Saturday morning in November. My mother had left early for her yoga class, kissing both of us goodbye and reminding Marcus that she'd be back by noon with groceries. I was supposed to clean my room and finish a book report that was due Monday. Instead, I was positioning my phone charger camera on my desk, angled to capture most of my bedroom. My hands were shaking as I activated the recording function, but my mind was clear. This was it. This was my chance. I went to the kitchen and deliberately knocked over a glass of orange juice, letting it spill across the counter and drip onto the floor. Then I stood there and waited. His footsteps on the stairs, the pause outside my door, the soft knock that was more threat than courtesy. "Celeste, I heard something fall. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I called back. "Just spilled some juice. I'm cleaning it up." "Let me help you with that." He was already coming into the kitchen, already reaching for the paper towels, already smiling that terrible smile. And I was already backing toward my room, leading him exactly where I needed him to go. "It's okay, I've got it," I said, grabbing more paper towels than I needed. "I'll just go wash my hands." I walked quickly to my bedroom, Marcus following behind me like I knew he would. He always followed when I tried to get away. It was part of the game for him, the chase before the catch. "You know, Celeste," he said, stopping in my doorway while I pretended to busy myself at my desk, "I've been thinking we need to have another conversation about being careful." My back was to him, but I could see his reflection in my computer screen. He was pulling out his cigarettes, taking his time, enjoying the buildup. In the corner of my screen, I could see the red recording light on my phone charger. "I've been very careful," I said, turning around to face him. "I haven't broken anything else." "No, but you've been asking questions again, about packages and neighbors and things that aren't your concern." He lit his cigarette, took that first long drag. "I thought we'd settled this, but apparently you need a stronger reminder." He stepped into my room, closing the door behind him with his free hand. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot in the silence. "Take off your shirt." The words hit me like a physical blow. He'd never asked me to undress before. The burns had always been quick, hidden, something that happened and was over before I could fully process what was happening. This was different. This was escalating. "Marcus, please." "Take off your shirt, Celeste. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." My hands moved to the hem of my sweater without my permission, muscle memory and fear overriding rational thought. But as I started to lift the fabric, my eyes caught the red light of the camera again, and I remembered why I was here, why this was happening. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about evidence. This was about making sure that what happened in this room could never be denied or dismissed or explained away. "Why do you want me to take off my shirt?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. He paused, cigarette halfway to his lips. What? You've never asked me to take off my shirt before. Why now? Something flickered in his eyes, confusion maybe, like he was wondering why I was asking questions instead of just obeying. Because I want to see the marks, he said slowly. I want to see what happens to girls who don't listen. You mean the burns, the ones you gave me with your cigarettes. The words hung in the air between us like smoke. I'd never said it out loud before, never named what he was doing to me. It had always been couched in euphemisms and implications, lessons and discipline and careful behavior. But not anymore. The burns, I repeated, louder this time. The ones on my shoulder blade, the one on my wrist, the one you're planning to give me right now. His face went very still. Celeste, what are you doing? I'm telling the truth. For the first time since this started, I'm telling the truth. I took a step backward, putting more distance between us. My stepfather burns me with cigarettes. He waits until we're alone, and then he hurts me, and then he tells me it's my fault for being careless or asking too many questions or existing in his space. Stop talking. His voice was low, dangerous. He's been doing it for over a year, 7 different burns so far. 7 times he's held a lit cigarette against my skin and watched me try not to scream. Celeste, stop. And my mother doesn't know because he's convinced her that I'm dramatic and untrustworthy, and he moved faster than I expected, crossing the room in 2 quick strides and grabbing my arm. The cigarette was inches from my face, hot and bright and smelling of tobacco and threat. You need to shut your mouth right now, he hissed, fingers digging into my bicep hard enough to leave bruises. You need to take off that shirt and let me finish what I started, and then you need to forget this conversation ever happened. I looked up at him, this man who had terrorized me for over a year, and felt something shift inside my chest. Not fear this time, not submission. Power. Are you going to burn me again? I asked, clearly, projecting my voice toward where I knew the camera was recording. His grip tightened.
What did you just say? I asked if you're going to burn me again, with that cigarette, like you've burned me 7 times before. For a moment, he just stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Then his eyes narrowed, and I saw him putting the pieces together. The questions, the volume of my voice, the way I kept looking toward my desk. What's on your desk, Celeste? My homework. What's on your desk? He released my arm and moved toward the phone charger, and I knew I had maybe 10 seconds before he figured out what it was. 10 seconds to get the evidence I needed. You're going to burn me because I spilled orange juice this morning, I said quickly, backing toward my bedroom door. You're going to burn me because you like hurting me, because you're a grown man who gets off on terrorizing a 17-year-old girl. He spun around, cigarette forgotten, eyes wild with rage and something that might have been panic. What did you do? I told the truth. What did you do? He was moving toward me again, but this time I was ready. This time I was already at the door, already turning the handle, already running. I made it to the living room before he caught me, his hand closing around my wrist and yanking me backward. The cigarette was gone, dropped somewhere in my bedroom, but his other hand was raised like he was planning to hit me. Where is it? He demanded, shaking me hard enough to rattle my teeth. Where's the camera? Instead of answering, I started screaming. Not the careful, quiet sounds I usually made when he hurt me, not the muffled sobs or bitten-back cries that I'd trained myself to suppress. This was different. This was every scream I'd held back for over a year. Every moment of pain and fear and helpless rage, all of it pouring out of me in one long, loud, undeniable sound. The neighbors heard me. Mrs. Patterson next door, who was watering her garden. Mr. Chen across the street, who was washing his car. The jogger who was passing by our house, who later told police that the screaming stopped him dead in his tracks. They all heard me, and for the first time in over a year, someone was listening. Marcus let go of my wrist like I'd burned him. His face was pale, panicked, and I could see him calculating. The screaming, the neighbors, the camera he now knew existed somewhere in my room. All the careful planning, all the months of grooming and manipulation and strategic positioning crumbling in the space of 5 minutes. Celeste, he said, hands raised like he was trying to calm a wild animal. Celeste, you need to stop screaming. The neighbors are going to call the police. I stopped screaming, but only so I could speak. Good, I said. I hope they do. That's when I saw the fear in his eyes, real fear, not the controlled anger or calculated intimidation he usually wielded like a weapon. This was the look of a man who suddenly understood that he was no longer the one in control. We stood there in the living room, staring at each other across a gulf that felt wider than the space between us. The man who had burned me 7 times, who had made me afraid of my own home, who had convinced my mother that I was the problem. And me, 17 years old, shaking with adrenaline and terror and something that might have been hope. The police arrived 4 minutes later. Officer Martinez had kind eyes and a gentle voice that made me want to cry all over again. She was the first responder who knocked on our door after the neighbors called in a domestic disturbance, and she was the one who sat with me on our front porch while her partner spoke with Marcus inside the house. "Can you tell me what happened today, Celeste?" she asked, her notepad balanced on her knee, pen poised but not pressing, like she had all the time in the world to listen to whatever I needed to say. I looked back at the house, where I could see Marcus through the living room window. He was animated, gesturing with his hands, probably spinning some story about teenage dramatics and misunderstandings. My mother's car wasn't in the driveway yet, which meant she was still at yoga, still oblivious to the fact that our life was about to implode. "He burns me," I said quietly, the words feeling strange and powerful in my mouth. "With cigarettes. He's been doing it for over a year." Officer Martinez's pen stilled. "Where does he burn you?" I pulled my sweater off my shoulder, showing her the constellation of scars that had been my secret for so long. In the daylight, they looked smaller than they felt, just 7 little circles of raised skin. But Officer Martinez sucked in a sharp breath like she was seeing something horrible. "How many times has this happened?" 7. Today was supposed to be number 8, but I gestured toward the house, toward the chaos I'd finally allowed to spill into the open. I couldn't let it happen again. "Celeste, this is very important. Do you have any proof of what you're telling me? Any documentation or witnesses?" My heart started beating faster. This was it. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the reason I'd sold my grandmother's necklace and learned about wireless cameras and spent weeks planning every detail. "I have video," I said. Officer Martinez's eyebrows shot up. "Video of what?" "Of him threatening to burn me, of him admitting that he's burned me before, of him trying to make me take off my shirt so he could do it again." The words came out in a rush, like I was afraid she'd stop listening if I spoke too slowly. "It's all recorded. Everything he said, everything he did. It's on my phone." She leaned forward, suddenly more focused. "Show me." I pulled out my phone and opened the app that connected to my hidden camera. The recording from that morning was already uploaded to the cloud, crystal clear and undeniable. I handed her the phone and watched her face as she saw Marcus in my bedroom, cigarette in hand, demanding that I undress. Her expression hardened with each passing second of footage. When it got to the part where Marcus grabbed my arm and started shaking me, demanding to know where the camera was, she paused the video. "This happened today?" "About 20 minutes ago." "And he didn't know he was being recorded?" "Not until the end. That's when he figured it out." Officer Martinez stood up, still holding my phone. "I need you to stay right here, okay? Don't go back in the house. Don't talk to anyone until I come back." She walked quickly toward the front door, calling for her partner. Through the window, I watched Marcus's confident posture crumble as she showed him something on her phone. His face went white, then red, then white again. He started talking faster, gesturing more frantically, but Officer Martinez just shook her head and said something that made him sit down heavily on our couch. That's when my mother's car pulled into the driveway. I'd been dreading this moment since I first decided to fight back. My mother, who had married Marcus because she said he made her feel safe. My mother, who trusted him to look after me when she wasn't home. My mother, who was about to learn that the man she'd been sharing a bed with for the past 18 months was a predator who had been systematically torturing her daughter. She got out of her car with yoga mat tucked under one arm and a smoothie in her other hand, looking relaxed and happy in the way she always did after her Saturday morning routine. Then she saw the police cars in our driveway, saw me sitting on the porch with red eyes and shaking hands, and her face transformed into something I'd never seen before, pure terror. Celeste? She dropped her yoga mat and ran toward me, smoothie forgotten on the sidewalk. Baby, what happened? Are you hurt? I opened my mouth to answer, but Officer Martinez appeared beside us before I could speak. Ma'am, are you Mrs. Collins? She asked my mother. Yes, I'm Sarah Collins. This is my daughter. What's going on? Why are there police cars in my driveway? Officer Martinez glanced at me, then back at my mother. Mrs. Collins, we need to talk. Your daughter has made some very serious allegations against your husband. Allegations? My mother looked between us, confusion and fear warring in her expression. What kind of allegations? Physical abuse, ma'am. Multiple incidents over the past year. The color drained from my mother's face. She sank down onto the porch step beside me, reaching for my hand with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves. Celeste, what is she talking about? I looked at her, this woman who had raised me alone for 12 years before Marcus came along, who had worked double shifts to pay for my school clothes and dance lessons and summer camps, who had cried happy tears when he proposed because she said we finally had a complete family. Mom, I said softly, Marcus has been hurting me. She stared at me for a long moment, searching my face like she was looking for signs of deception or confusion. Hurting you how? He burns me with cigarettes when you're not home, 7 times so far. I tried to tell you, but I trailed off, not knowing how to explain the careful way he'd painted me as dramatic and untrustworthy. 7 times? Her voice was barely a whisper. Officer Martinez knelt down beside us. Mrs. Collins, your daughter has video evidence of your husband threatening her with a lit cigarette. She also has physical evidence in the form of burn scars. We're going to need you to take a look at the recording. My mother took the phone with hands that shook so badly I was afraid she'd drop it. I watched her face as she saw Marcus in my bedroom, watched her expression change from confusion to horror to something that looked like rage. Oh my God, she breathed. Oh my God, Celeste. The video played for 3 minutes and 47 seconds. 3 minutes and 47 seconds of my stepfather casually discussing the burns he'd given me, demanding that I undress so he could give me another one, grabbing me and shaking me when I refused to comply. When it ended, my mother was crying. I didn't know, she said over and over. I swear to God I didn't know. Officer Martinez stood up. Mrs. Collins, we're placing your husband under arrest. We'll need Celeste to come to the station to give a formal statement, and we'll need photographs of her injuries for evidence. Yes, my mother said immediately. Yes, whatever you need. Through the window, I could see Marcus being led out of our house in handcuffs. His eyes found mine as they put him in the back of the patrol car, and for a moment, he looked like the man I'd first met 18 months ago, confused and hurt and betrayed, like he couldn't understand how we'd gotten to this point. But I remembered the hunger in his eyes when he held that first cigarette against my skin. I remembered the satisfaction in his voice when he told me that careless girls needed to learn to be more careful. I remembered every threat, every burn, every moment of terror he'd put me through, and I felt nothing but relief as they drove him away. The police station was nothing like I had expected. I'd imagined something cold and institutional, all fluorescent lights and metal chairs. Instead, they took me to a comfortable room with soft lighting and artwork on the walls, the kind of place designed to help traumatized people feel safe enough to tell their stories. Detective Rodriguez was assigned to my case. She was maybe 45 with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes, the kind of person who looked like she'd seen everything but still cared about justice. She explained that she specialized in domestic violence cases involving minors and that she'd be working with me throughout the entire investigation. The first thing I need you to know, she said, settling into the chair across from me, is that none of this is your fault. Adults are responsible for protecting children, not hurting them. What Marcus did to you is a crime, and you did exactly the right thing by reporting it.
My mother was sitting beside me, holding my hand so tightly I could feel her pulse through her fingertips. She hadn't stopped crying since we left the house, quiet tears that she kept wiping away with tissues from the box Detective Rodriguez had placed between us. I know this is difficult, the detective continued, but I need you to tell me everything, from the first time he hurt you until today. Take your time and don't leave anything out. So I told her. I told her about the dropped plate and the first burn on my shoulder blade. I told her about the textbook left on the coffee table and the second burn on my wrist. I told her about all 7 incidents, describing each one in detail while my mother listened with her hand pressed over her mouth. I told her about Marcus's careful manipulation, the way he'd convinced my mother that I was prone to dramatics and exaggeration. I told her about the misdelivered package and how that had sparked my decision to fight back. I told her about selling my grandmother's necklace to buy the camera equipment. You planned this, Detective Rodriguez said, and there was something like admiration in her voice. You knew he was going to hurt you again, so you set up a way to record it. I knew no one would believe me without proof, I said. He's very good at seeming normal, charming even, and he made sure everyone thought I was the problem. Detective Rodriguez made notes as I talked, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and times and specific details. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with those sharp, intelligent eyes. Celeste, what you did took incredible courage and intelligence. Most adults wouldn't have been able to plan and execute something like this. You essentially conducted your own investigation and gathered evidence that will make our job much easier.
Does that mean he'll go to prison? My mother asked. Her voice was hoarse from crying, barely above a whisper. It means we have a very strong case, Detective Rodriguez replied. The video evidence is compelling, and the physical evidence supports Celeste's testimony. We'll also be interviewing neighbors, teachers, anyone who might have observed changes in Celeste's behavior over the past year. She turned back to me. I need you to think carefully. Did anyone ever ask you about injuries or notice anything that might be relevant? Teachers, friends, other family members? I thought back over the past year, trying to remember if anyone had ever questioned the various excuses I'd made for burns and bruises and changes in my behavior. My English teacher, Mrs. Hendricks, she asked me a few times if everything was okay at home. I always said yes, but she kept asking. And my friend Zoe noticed that I stopped wearing short sleeves, even when it was hot outside. We'll want to talk to both of them, Detective Rodriguez said, making more notes. Anyone else? The school nurse. I went to her office once because a burn got infected. I told her I'd burned myself cooking, but she looked at it for a long time and asked a lot of questions about how exactly it had happened. My mother made a small, wounded sound. You got an infection? I looked at her, this woman who was supposed to protect me, who had been sleeping next to my abuser for over a year without knowing what he was doing to me. Part of me was angry at her for not seeing, for not knowing, for trusting him so completely. But a bigger part of me just felt sorry for both of us. It wasn't bad, I said. It healed fine. But Detective Rodriguez was writing furiously. Medical records will be helpful. If the nurse documented her concerns or took photos of the wound, that's additional evidence. We spent another hour going over details, establishing timelines, and discussing what would happen next. Marcus would be held pending arraignment, where a judge would decide whether to grant bail. I would need to testify before a grand jury, and if they decided to indict, there would be a trial. I know this seems overwhelming, Detective Rodriguez said as we prepared to leave, but you've already done the hardest part. You survived, you fought back, and you made sure he can't hurt you anymore. Everything else is just paperwork and procedure. As we walked out of the police station, my mother stopped suddenly in the middle of the parking lot. I failed you, she said, turning to face me with tears streaming down her cheeks. I brought him into our home, I trusted him with you, and I failed to protect you from him. I am so, so sorry. I looked at her, this broken woman who was blaming herself for the actions of a predator, and felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. You didn't know, I said. He was careful. He made sure you wouldn't see. But I should have seen. I should have paid attention. I should have listened when you tried to tell me. When did I try to tell you? She was quiet for a moment, thinking. You didn't, did you? Not directly. But there were signs. You became more withdrawn, more anxious. You stopped wearing certain clothes. You started spending more time in your room with the door locked. He taught me not to tell, I said. He was very good at making me believe that no one would believe me. But I'm your mother. You should have been able to tell me anything. I nodded. Yeah, I should have. We stood there in the parking lot, two women who had been living in the same house with a monster, both of us too damaged by his manipulation to know how to comfort each other. Finally, my mother reached for me, pulling me into a hug that felt desperate and grateful and heartbroken all at once. I'm never going to let anyone hurt you again, she whispered into my hair. I promise, I'm going to do better. I held her back, this imperfect woman who had tried her best and failed and was now trying to figure out how to make it right. We couldn't undo the past year. We couldn't erase the scars or the fear or the damage that Marcus had done to our family. But we could start over. We could build something new from the wreckage he'd left behind. The drive home was quiet. My mother kept glancing at me in the passenger seat, like she was seeing me for the first time. Maybe she was. For over a year, Marcus had been telling her that I was dramatic, untrustworthy, prone to exaggeration. Now she was realizing that her quiet, careful daughter had actually been a victim who was too smart and too scared to ask for help. Your camera, she said suddenly, it's still in your room? Yeah, hidden in a phone charger on my desk. Show me. Back at the house, which felt different now, emptier somehow, I led her to my bedroom and pointed out the tiny device that had captured the evidence needed to put Marcus away. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands like it was something magical. How did you know how to do this? YouTube videos mostly, and some websites about home security. You researched surveillance equipment. You figured out how to buy it and install it without anyone knowing. You set up a cloud storage account and learned how to access the recordings? She looked at me with something that might have been awe. You're 17 years old. I had to do something. He wasn't going to stop. She sat down on my bed, still holding the camera. What else has he done? Beyond the burns, I mean. Has he... She couldn't finish the question, but I knew what she was asking. No, he never touched me that way. It was always just the cigarettes, and the threats, and making me feel like I was crazy. She nodded, relief and guilt warring in her expression.
The neighbors heard you screaming today. Mrs. Patterson called 911. She said she'd never heard anything like it. I'd never screamed like that before. He always made sure I stayed quiet. How? I thought about how to explain the careful psychology of abuse, the way Marcus had trained me to believe that making noise would only make things worse, that no one would believe me anyway, that I was the problem. He convinced me that it was my fault, that I deserved it for being careless or dramatic or asking too many questions. And he made sure you thought I was unstable, so if I ever did try to tell someone, they'd think I was making it up. My mother's face crumpled. He played us against each other. Yeah, he did. She stood up abruptly, walking to my window and staring out at the street where our neighbors were probably still talking about the police cars and the screaming and the arrest. I'm divorcing him, she said. Good. I'm selling this house. We're moving somewhere he can never find us. Okay. And I'm going to therapy. We both are, together and separately. We're going to figure out how to heal from this. I walked over to stand beside her at the window. Outside, everything looked normal. Mrs. Patterson was watering her garden again, like nothing had changed. Mr. Chen was still washing his car. The world had kept turning while mine was falling apart and rebuilding itself in the space of a single afternoon. Mom, I said, yeah, I'm proud of us. For surviving this, for fighting back. She turned to look at me, tears fresh on her cheeks. I'm proud of you, for being braver than I ever was, for being smarter than I ever was. We're going to be okay, I said, and for the first time in over a year, I actually believed it. That night, I slept in my mother's bed, not because I was afraid, but because neither of us wanted to be alone. We talked until almost dawn, filling in the gaps in each other's understanding of the past year.
She told me about the subtle ways Marcus had undermined her confidence in her parenting, made her second-guess her instincts about me. I told her about the constant fear, the careful way I'd learned to monitor his moods and predict his behavior. He isolated us from each other, she said, as the sun was starting to rise outside her bedroom window. Yeah, but we found our way back. 3 days later, Detective Rodriguez called to let us know that Marcus had been formally charged with 7 counts of child abuse and 1 count of assault. The grand jury had seen the video evidence and voted to indict. He was being held without bail, deemed a flight risk and a danger to the community. His attorney is already talking about a plea deal, she told us. He knows the evidence is overwhelming. What kind of plea deal? My mother asked. We were both on speakerphone in our kitchen, the same kitchen where Marcus had burned me that first time. Prison time, probably 5 to 10 years, plus mandatory registration as a child abuser. He'd also be required to stay away from you both permanently. And if he doesn't take the plea, then we go to trial, and he's looking at 15 to 20 years if convicted, which he would be, given the evidence we have. After we hung up, my mother and I sat in silence for a while. 5 to 10 years seemed like both a long time and not nearly long enough. But it was justice. It was acknowledgement that what he'd done to me was real and wrong and criminal. How do you feel about it? My mother asked. I thought about it. How did I feel about the man who had terrorized me for over a year, potentially spending the next decade in prison? I feel like I can breathe again, I said finally. And I could. For the first time since that first burn, I could take a full, deep breath without feeling like there was a weight pressing down on my chest. I could walk through my house without listening for his footsteps. I could sleep without checking that my door was locked. I was free. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings and therapy appointments and difficult conversations. Marcus's attorney did indeed work out a plea deal, 7 years in state prison plus 5 years of supervised probation. He would also be required to register as a child abuser and would be prohibited from living within 1,000 feet of schools or playgrounds. He never apologized, never showed remorse. Even at his sentencing hearing, when the judge asked if he had anything to say to me, he just stared straight ahead and remained silent. I didn't need his apology anyway. I had something better. I had my voice back. I had my power back. I had my life back. And I had plans for what to do with it. The idea came to me during one of my therapy sessions with Dr. Kim, a gentle woman who specialized in trauma recovery for adolescents. We were talking about the way Marcus had made me doubt my own perceptions, the way he'd convinced me that my reality wasn't trustworthy. It's called gaslighting, she explained. It's a form of psychological manipulation where the abuser makes the victim question their own memory, perception, and sanity. How do people recover from that? By reconnecting with their own truth, by learning to trust their instincts again, and sometimes by helping others who have gone through similar experiences. That's when it clicked for me. I wasn't the only teenage girl who had been gaslighted and manipulated by a trusted adult. I wasn't the only one who had felt isolated and voiceless and trapped. But I was one of the few who had fought back successfully, one of the few who had managed to gather evidence and make it stick, one of the few who had turned the tables on her abuser. Maybe I could help others do the same. I started small, with a blog post on a platform for survivors of abuse. I wrote about my experience with Marcus, about the way he'd isolated me from my mother and convinced everyone that I was the problem. I wrote about the surveillance equipment and the cloud storage and the legal process. But mostly, I wrote about hope, about the fact that even when you feel powerless, even when everyone tells you that you're crazy or dramatic or asking for trouble, you still have more strength and intelligence than you know. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, I had dozens of messages from other survivors, mostly young women who had been abused by stepfathers or boyfriends or family friends. They shared their stories, asked for advice, and thanked me for showing them that it was possible to fight back. One message stood out. It was from a girl named Emma who was 15 and living with a stepmother who had been hitting her and threatening her for months. Her father traveled for work and was rarely home, and like me, she'd been convinced that no one would believe her if she reported the abuse. "I read your blog post 3 times, she wrote. "I've been thinking about setting up a camera like you did, but I don't know where to start." could you help me?" I stared at her message for a long time, thinking about what it meant to help someone gather evidence against their abuser. The legal implications, the safety concerns, the emotional weight of guiding another teenager through the process I'd navigated alone. Then I thought about who I was at 14, washing dishes and dropping plates, and trying to understand why the adults who were supposed to protect me were hurting me instead. I wrote back that same night. "Yes," I told Emma, "I can help you, and you're going to be okay." Emma wasn't the only one. Over the following months, my inbox filled with messages from teenagers across the country who had read my blog and recognized their own situations in my words. Sarah from Oregon, whose uncle was molesting her during family visits. Jake from Texas, whose stepfather was beating him with a belt and threatening to kill him if he told anyone. Maria from Florida, whose mother's boyfriend was forcing her to steal money from her classmates and teachers. Each story was different, but the patterns were the same: isolated kids, manipulative adults, and a system that seemed designed to protect abusers rather than victims. These teenagers had tried to tell trusted adults before and been dismissed, disbelieved, or blamed for their own abuse. They'd learned, like I had, that their voices didn't matter. But they'd also learned something else from my story. They'd learned that evidence mattered more than words, that documentation could make the difference between being believed and being ignored, and that sometimes you had to save yourself because no one else would do it for you. I started small, helping Emma set up her surveillance system and coaching her through the process of gathering evidence against her abusive stepmother. We communicated through encrypted messaging apps, using techniques I'd learned from online privacy guides to make sure her stepmother couldn't monitor our conversations. Emma was smart, methodical, and absolutely terrified. Her stepmother, Linda, was a nurse who knew exactly how to hurt someone without leaving obvious marks. She favored psychological torture over physical violence, but when she did hit, she was strategic about it. A slap across the face that would fade by morning, a kick to the stomach that wouldn't show through clothes, a grip on the arm that left fingerprint bruises hidden under long sleeves. "She knows what she's doing," Emma wrote to me one night. "She's done this before. Maybe to her own kids, maybe to other people. She's too good at it for me to be the first." That observation sent chills down my spine, because Emma was right. The calculated nature of Linda's abuse, the way she manipulated Emma's father and isolated Emma from potential support systems, the sophisticated psychological tactics she used to maintain control, none of that developed overnight. Linda was an experienced predator who had probably been victimizing children for years. "We need to move fast," I told Emma. "People like her don't stop. They just get better at hiding what they're doing." Working with Emma taught me that helping other survivors wasn't just about providing technical advice or emotional support. It was about understanding each unique situation and developing strategies that accounted for the specific dangers each victim faced. Emma's stepmother was different from Marcus, more subtle, more psychologically sophisticated, and potentially more dangerous if she realized she was being monitored. We spent weeks planning Emma's documentation strategy. Unlike my situation, where Marcus's explosive temper made it relatively easy to predict when he would act out, Linda's abuse was more sporadic and harder to anticipate. She might go days or even weeks without physically hurting Emma, then suddenly explode into violence over something minor. "I think she enjoys the unpredictability," Emma wrote. "She likes keeping me scared, never knowing when it's coming." That insight led us to a different approach than the one I'd used with Marcus. Instead of trying to provoke a single incident that could be recorded, Emma would need to document patterns of behavior over time. Multiple cameras, multiple recordings, building a comprehensive picture of abuse that no defense attorney could dismiss as an isolated incident or misunderstanding. Emma was a natural at the technical aspects. She set up cameras in 3 different locations, each one disguised as common household objects. She created multiple cloud storage accounts under different names, ensuring that even if Linda discovered one recording system, the others would remain intact. Most importantly, she documented everything, keeping detailed logs of dates, times, and specific incidents that corresponded with her video evidence. The first breakthrough came 3 weeks into our surveillance operation. Linda had been having a bad day at work and came home spoiling for a fight.
She found Emma doing homework at the kitchen table and started criticizing everything, from her posture to her handwriting to her choice of subjects. "You're going to fail geometry," Linda announced, looming over Emma's shoulder, "just like you fail at everything else you try." Emma kept writing, trying to ignore the provocation. This was another thing we'd discussed, the importance of not escalating situations when cameras were recording. Let the abuser reveal their true nature without giving them ammunition to claim they were provoked. "Are you ignoring me?" Linda's voice rose. "I'm talking to you, you little brat." Emma looked up calmly. "I heard you. I'm trying to finish my homework." What happened next was captured in perfect detail by the camera Emma had hidden in a decorative bowl on the kitchen counter. Linda grabbed Emma's math textbook and slammed it shut, nearly catching Emma's fingers in the process. Then she swept the rest of Emma's homework off the table, scattering papers across the kitchen floor. "Clean that up," Linda ordered, "and when you're done, you can go to your room and think about how to show proper respect to the adults in this house." Emma knelt down and began gathering her papers, and that's when Linda kicked her. Not hard enough to cause serious injury, but hard enough to send Emma sprawling across the kitchen tiles. Hard enough to make it clear that this was deliberate, calculated violence. "Clumsy," Linda said with satisfaction, "just like your mother was." The recording was devastating. It showed Linda's calculated cruelty, the way she engineered the entire confrontation to justify hurting Emma. But more than that, it showed something that would be crucial in court: Linda's demeanor after the attack. She wasn't angry or out of control. She was satisfied, almost pleased with herself. "She enjoyed it," Emma wrote to me that night. "You can see it on her face. She liked hurting me." I watched the video 3 times, my stomach churning with each viewing. Emma was right. Linda's expression after kicking her was unmistakably one of enjoyment. This wasn't discipline or anger management gone wrong. This was someone who derived pleasure from causing pain to a child. "This is enough," I told Emma. "We need to contact the police." But Emma hesitated. "What if they don't believe me? What if Linda convinces them that I'm lying?" It was the same fear I'd had, the same doubt that had kept me silent for so long. But Emma had something I hadn't, a support system that extended beyond her immediate family. "Your soccer coach," I reminded her, "the one who asked about your bruises last month. She's a mandated reporter."
If you show her this video, she'll have to involve Child Protective Services. And if Linda finds out I recorded her? She's already hurting you, Emma. This video proves it. The question isn't whether she'll hurt you again, it's whether you want to stop her before she does it to someone else. That argument finally convinced her. The next day, Emma stayed after soccer practice and showed Coach Williams the recording. Coach Williams immediately called both the police and Child Protective Services, triggering an investigation that would ultimately result in Linda's arrest and Emma's removal from the home. The legal process was faster than mine had been. Linda's nursing license meant she was held to a higher standard of conduct, and the video evidence was so clear that her attorney advised her to accept a plea deal rather than go to trial. She pled guilty to child abuse charges and was sentenced to 3 years in prison plus mandatory counseling and permanent removal from the child abuse registry. More importantly, the investigation revealed that Emma had been right about Linda's history. A deeper look into her background uncovered complaints from previous stepchildren and foster children, reports that had been filed but never properly investigated. Emma's courage in coming forward had potentially saved other children from years of abuse. "I couldn't have done this without you," Emma wrote to me after Linda's sentencing. "You showed me that it was possible to fight back." But Emma had shown me something too. She'd proven that my experience with Marcus wasn't just a personal victory. It was a template that could be adapted and used by other survivors in similar situations. The techniques I developed, the strategies I'd used, the lessons I'd learned, all of it could be shared and modified to help other kids escape from abusive situations. That realization changed everything for me. I started the documentation project 6 months after Emma's case was resolved. It began as a simple website with resources for teenage abuse survivors, but it quickly evolved into something more comprehensive. I developed guides for different types of surveillance equipment, tutorials on digital security and evidence preservation, and step-by-step instructions for working with law enforcement and child protective services. But the most important part of the project was the mentorship program. Survivors who had successfully used documentation to escape abuse would be paired with current victims who needed guidance and support. We used encrypted communication channels, anonymous accounts, and carefully vetted volunteers to ensure everyone's safety. My mother was initially concerned about my involvement in what she called dangerous situations. "You're 18 years old," she said during one of our kitchen table conversations that had become a regular ritual since Marcus's conviction. "You should be focused on college applications and prom and normal teenage things, not helping other kids gather evidence against their abusers." I understood her worry. She'd spent the past year watching me heal from trauma, and she was afraid that helping other survivors might re-traumatize me or put me in danger. But she also understood something important about who I'd become. "This isn't about trauma," I told her. "This is about justice and prevention and making sure that other kids don't have to suffer in silence the way I did." She was quiet for a moment, stirring sugar into her tea in that familiar gesture that had become comforting rather than triggering. "You know, sometimes I look at you and I can't believe you're my daughter. Not because you don't seem like mine, but because you've become someone stronger and braver than I ever imagined possible." "I learned from the best," I said, meaning it. My mother's resilience in rebuilding our life after Marcus, her commitment to therapy and healing, her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes and work to do better, all of that had taught me more about courage than any self-help book or motivational speech. The documentation project grew rapidly. Within a year, we were helping dozens of teenagers across the country gather evidence against their abusers. Our success rate was remarkable. Over 80% of the cases where survivors followed our protocols resulted in successful prosecutions or removal from abusive situations. But success came with challenges I hadn't anticipated. Some of the cases were more complex than Emma's or mine. Kids who were being trafficked by family members, teenagers whose abusers were law enforcement officers or judges or other people with the power to manipulate the system. Survivors whose documentation efforts had been discovered, resulting in escalated violence or threats. Each case taught me something new about the landscape of abuse and the systems designed to address it. I learned about the gaps in child protective services, the ways that abusers manipulated custody laws, the challenges of prosecuting cases that cross state lines. I learned about the intersection of abuse and poverty, about how economic dependence could trap families in dangerous situations. Most importantly, I learned that documentation was just the beginning. Evidence might be enough to stop individual abusers, but addressing the broader problem required systemic change. That realization led to the second phase of the documentation project. We started advocating for legal reforms that would make it easier for minors to report abuse and harder for abusers to escape consequences. We lobbied for improved training for teachers, social workers, and law enforcement officers. We pushed for better funding for organizations that supported abuse survivors. The advocacy work brought me into contact with legislators, child welfare experts, and other survivor advocates. Many of them were impressed by the documentation techniques we'd developed and the success rates we'd achieved, but some were concerned about teenagers conducting their own surveillance operations. "There are safety issues," argued Dr. Patricia Vance, a child psychologist who testified before the state legislature about abuse prevention. "What if an abuser discovers they're being recorded and retaliates? What if these kids put themselves in more danger trying to gather evidence?" It was a valid concern, one that kept me awake at night sometimes. But it missed the fundamental reality that these kids were already in danger. The question wasn't whether to put them at risk, they were already at risk. The question was whether to give them tools to protect themselves or leave them defenseless. "Every survivor we've worked with was already being abused," I testified at the same hearing. "We don't create dangerous situations. We help kids who are already in dangerous situations find ways to escape them." The testimony was part of a push for legislation that would provide legal protections for minors who recorded evidence of their own abuse. Under existing laws, recording someone without their consent was often illegal, even if that person was abusing you. We wanted to create a specific exception that would allow minors to document abuse for the purpose of reporting it to authorities. The bill faced opposition from defense attorneys who argued it would lead to false accusations and privacy advocates who worried about expanding surveillance powers. But it had strong support from law enforcement, child welfare organizations, and survivor advocacy groups. The debate played out over months of committee hearings, public forums, and media coverage.
I found myself at the center of a national conversation about childhood abuse, digital privacy, and the rights of minors to protect themselves. It was during one of these media appearances that I met Detective Sarah Chen from the Los Angeles Police Department. She'd been following my work with the documentation project and had started using our protocols in her own cases involving teenage abuse survivors. The difference is remarkable, she told me during a break in filming for a news segment about the proposed legislation. Kids who have video evidence are taken more seriously by prosecutors, judges, and juries. The conviction rates are significantly higher. Detective Chen had seen hundreds of abuse cases over her 15-year career, but she said the documentation approach was revolutionary. Most of these cases come down to he said, she explained. A kid's word against an adult's word, and adults usually win. But when you have video evidence, when you can show exactly what happened, everything changes. She told me about a case involving a 13-year-old boy whose father was beating him with a wooden paddle every night. The boy had tried to report the abuse multiple times, but his father was a respected businessman in their community, and the boy had behavioral issues at school. Nobody believed him, Detective Chen said, until he started recording the beatings. Then nobody could ignore what was happening. The father in that case was eventually sentenced to 5 years in prison, and the boy was placed with relatives who provided a safe, supportive environment. It was another success story, another life saved through documentation. But Detective Chen also shared cases that didn't end as well. Kids whose recording devices were discovered before they could gather sufficient evidence, teenagers who were hurt worse after their abusers realized they were being monitored, survivors whose families turned against them for betraying abusive relatives. This work you're doing, she said, it's important, but it's also dangerous. You need to make sure these kids understand the risks. That conversation led to a major revision of our protocols. We developed more sophisticated safety planning, better techniques for concealing recording devices, and stronger support systems for survivors whose documentation efforts were discovered. We also started requiring all participants to work with local law enforcement or child protective services from the beginning, rather than trying to handle everything on their own. The revised protocols were put to the test when we started with Marcus, a 16-year-old from Michigan whose stepfather was forcing him to participate in illegal activities. The stepfather, Ray, was involved in drug dealing and was using Marcus as a courier, threatening to hurt Marcus's younger sister if he refused to cooperate. Marcus's situation was more complex than anything we dealt with before. The abuse wasn't just physical or emotional, it was criminal exploitation that put Marcus at risk of arrest and prosecution. Recording Ray's activities could provide evidence of abuse, but it could also document Marcus's own involvement in illegal drug transactions. I need proof that he's forcing me to do this, Marcus wrote to me through our encrypted communication system.
But I'm scared that if I record him, I'll just be creating evidence that I'm a drug dealer too. It was a legitimate concern that required consultation with attorneys who specialized in juvenile justice. We eventually developed a strategy that focused on recording the threats and coercion rather than the actual drug transactions. Marcus would document Ray's violence and intimidation, his threats against Marcus's sister, and his explicit statements about forcing Marcus to participate in illegal activities. The plan worked perfectly. Marcus gathered hours of recordings that clearly showed Ray threatening violence against both Marcus and his sister, explicitly describing the consequences if Marcus refused to make drug deliveries, and bragging about using teenagers as disposable couriers who would face less serious charges if caught. The recordings led to a major investigation that resulted not only in Ray's arrest, but also the dismantling of an entire drug distribution network that had been exploiting dozens of teenagers. Marcus was granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation, and he and his sister were placed in protective custody while the case was being prosecuted. "You saved more than just my life," Marcus wrote to me after Ray's conviction. "You saved my sister's life, and probably a bunch of other kids who would have gotten pulled into this if it had kept going." That case taught me that abuse rarely happens in isolation. Abusers often have multiple victims, and stopping one person can have ripple effects that protect many others. It reinforced my belief that survivor advocacy wasn't just about individual cases. It was about systemic change that could prevent future abuse. By the time I graduated from high school, the documentation project had helped over 200 survivors escape abusive situations. Our success rate had remained consistently high, and our protocols had been adopted by law enforcement agencies and child welfare organizations across the country. The legislation we'd advocated for had passed in 12 states, with similar bills pending in 8 more. But perhaps most importantly, the project had started changing the conversation about childhood abuse. Instead of focusing solely on reporting systems that often failed young victims, we were talking about empowering survivors to gather their own evidence and advocate for their own safety. On graduation day, sitting in the auditorium where I'd spent 4 years learning algebra and literature and social studies, I thought about the girl I'd been when I first walked into this school. Scared, isolated, carrying secrets that felt too heavy to bear. Convinced that no one would believe me if I told the truth about what was happening at home. That girl had learned to fight back, to use technology and intelligence and determination to save herself. But more than that, she'd learned that her experience could be a source of strength for others, that surviving trauma could become a foundation for creating change. My mother was in the audience, crying happy tears and taking pictures like every other proud parent. But I knew she was thinking about the journey we'd both taken to get to this moment. The broken trust that had been rebuilt, the fear that had been transformed into activism, the silence that had become a voice for other survivors. After the ceremony, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "Your father would be so proud of you." She was talking about my biological father, who had died when I was 12. The man Marcus had never been able to replace, despite his attempts to position himself as my protector and guide. He would have stopped Marcus, I said. If Dad had been alive, none of that would have happened. Maybe, my mother agreed. But then you never would have become who you are now. And all those kids you've helped, they might still be trapped in their situations. It was a strange way to think about trauma, as something that could ultimately lead to positive change. But she wasn't wrong. My experience with Marcus had been horrible, but it had also given me insights and skills and motivation that I might never have developed otherwise. As I looked around at my graduating class, I wondered how many of them had secrets similar to mine. How many were going home to situations that weren't safe, to adults who hurt them or threatened them or made them feel powerless. I couldn't save all of them, but I could keep working to make sure that the ones who needed help knew where to find it. The documentation project continued to grow throughout my college years. I studied criminal justice and psychology, learning about the theoretical frameworks that supported the practical work I was already doing. I wrote my senior thesis on the effectiveness of survivor-generated evidence in child abuse prosecutions, using data from hundreds of cases we documented. The thesis caught the attention of national media and policy organizations. I was invited to speak at conferences, testify before congressional committees, and consult with law enforcement agencies about improving their approaches to childhood abuse cases. But the work that mattered most to me was still the individual cases. Kids like Emma and Marcus who reached out for help and found the courage to document their abuse and fight back against their abusers. Each success story reminded me why I'd started this work in the first place. 5 years after Marcus's conviction, I received a letter from him in prison. My mother had forwarded it to me without opening it, leaving the decision about whether to read it entirely up to me. I almost threw it away. What could he possibly have to say that I needed to hear? But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the envelope with trembling hands. The letter was short, written in the same careful handwriting I remembered from school forms and birthday cards. "Celeste," it began, "I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you don't want to read this. But I wanted you to know that I've spent every day of the past 5 years thinking about what I did to you, and I am truly sorry." He went on to describe the therapy he'd been participating in, his growing understanding of the harm he'd caused, his commitment to never hurting anyone again. He didn't make excuses or try to minimize his actions. He simply acknowledged what he'd done and expressed remorse for it. "I know that sorry isn't enough," the letter concluded, "and I'm not asking for forgiveness or contact or anything from you. I just wanted you to know that you were right to fight back, and I hope you've been able to build a good life despite everything I put you through." I read the letter 3 times, trying to decide how I felt about it. It was the apology I'd never received at his sentencing, the acknowledgement of wrongdoing that might have meant something if it had come sooner. But it also felt insufficient. Words on paper couldn't undo the scars on my shoulder or the months of fear I'd lived with,
They couldn't restore the innocence he'd taken or repair the damage he'd done to my relationship with my mother. Still, there was something to be said for accountability. Marcus had spent years in prison thinking about his actions and their consequences. He'd participated in counseling and treatment programs. He'd come to understand, at least intellectually, the harm he'd caused. It was more than many survivors ever got from their abusers. I never wrote back, but I kept the letter, not as forgiveness, but as a reminder of the power of consequences. Marcus's life had been fundamentally changed by his conviction. He would never be able to work with children again, never be able to live near schools or playgrounds, never be able to convince another woman to trust him with her teenage daughter. The system had worked, at least in his case. Evidence had led to conviction, conviction had led to imprisonment, and imprisonment had led to reflection and remorse. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was justice. Years later, when I was running my own nonprofit organization focused on survivor advocacy and policy reform, I would use Marcus's letter as an example of why documentation mattered. Not because it guaranteed perfect outcomes or transform abusers into better people, but because it created accountability where none had existed before. Today, the Documentation Project has helped over 1,000 survivors escape abusive situations. Our protocols have been implemented by child welfare agencies in 38 states, and our advocacy efforts have contributed to legislative reforms that make it easier for minors to report abuse and harder for abusers to escape consequences. But the work isn't finished. There are still kids who are trapped in dangerous situations, still adults who exploit their power to harm children, still systems that fail to protect the most vulnerable members of our society. Every day, my inbox fills with messages from survivors who need help, guidance, and support. Some of them are 13 years old and terrified. Others are adults who were abused as children and are just now finding the courage to seek justice. Each message reminds me of the girl I was at 17, holding a hidden camera and planning to document my stepfather's abuse. Scared but determined, isolated but not powerless, ready to fight for my own survival and eventual freedom. I couldn't have imagined then that my story would become a roadmap for others, that my pain would be transformed into a tool for change, that my silence would eventually become a voice for the voiceless. But that's exactly what happened, and it's still happening, one survivor at a time, one case at a time, one victory at a time. The scars on my shoulder will never fade completely. They're a permanent reminder of what Marcus did to me, of the year I spent living in fear and thinking I was powerless to change my situation. But they're also a reminder of my own strength, of my ability to survive and fight back and transform trauma into purpose. Some days, I trace those 7 small circles with my fingertip and remember the girl who thought she had no voice, no power, no way out. Then I think about Emma and Marcus and the hundreds of other survivors who found their voices, claimed their power, and created their own ways out. And I know that girl was wrong. She always had everything she needed to save herself. She just had to learn how to use it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.